the small town of Oak River, nestled in the remote forests of northern Canada, Jeremy lived with his 2 children in a modest house. His life had once been filled with hope and dreams for the future. As a proud native father, he had always worked hard to provide for his family, holding on to the traditions of his people and cherishing the simple pleasures of life. But in the months leading up to his fateful decision, everything seemed to spiral out of control. It started innocently enough with a business venture, a small logging company that Jeremy believed could secure a stable future for his children. He poured his savings into the venture, convinced that success was within reach. But things went wrong quickly. The market shifted, contracts fell through, and soon the business was drowning in debt. The financial strain became unbearable, and Jeremy was left with no way to cover his bills or protect his home. Desperation began to cloud his judgment. Jeremy's wife, Lily, had been battling a chronic illness for years. Her condition worsened, and she needed expensive treatment. Jeremy had already sold off anything of value that could help cover her medical bills. He took on loans, borrowing from friends, family, and even strangers, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. But no matter how hard he worked, the money never seemed to be enough. The stress of keeping up with mounting debts and trying to care for Lily was taking a heavy toll on him. The pressure of it all weighed on his mind, leaving him exhausted and hopeless. The thought of losing his home, the place where his children had grown up, terrified him. Jeremy loved his kids more than anything in the world, but his circumstances were pushing him toward an impossible choice. He considered the options, the paths that could get him out of this mess. But no matter what he tried, the debts kept piling up. He reached out to everyone he knew, trying to borrow or beg for more help, but no one had anything left to give. One cold evening in November, Jeremy received a call from a man he had met briefly at a local event. The man, who introduced himself as Vance, offered a solution to Jeremy's financial troubles. Vance had connections to a network that could help people like Jeremy in dire situations. He spoke about a way out, money in exchange for a person. Jeremy didn't fully understand what was being offered at first, but when Vance described the amount of money that would be involved, the weight of his desperation pushed him into thinking it was the only way. Vance promised that his daughter would be well taken care of. He told Jeremy that she would be given a better life in a faraway place, one where money wouldn't be a problem anymore. The words hung in the air like a bad omen, but Jeremy pushed them aside. He needed the money. Lily needed the treatment. His children needed stability. The price of what Vance was offering felt like a solution that was too good to pass up. With a heavy heart and a mind clouded by panic, Jeremy agreed. He knew what he was about to do was irreversible, but the desperation for financial relief and fear of losing everything pushed him forward. The night before Aiyana disappeared, he told his daughter that they would be taking a trip to the city. He tried to reassure her, but deep inside he knew the truth. This was the last time he would see her the way she was. Jeremy's decision was one made from a place of unbearable desperation, and in the pit of his soul, he knew it was a choice he would never escape. But for the first time in months, the weight of his financial burden seemed to lift, if only for a brief moment. The price of that fleeting relief, however, would soon come crashing down with consequences he could never have predicted. The morning Aiyana disappeared began like any other, with the crisp winter air biting at the skin and the sun barely breaking over the horizon. Jeremy woke early, as he always did, preparing to take his daughter on a trip to the nearby city. He had told her the day before that they were going to visit an event, something special he had planned as a surprise. Aiyana, excited for the adventure, packed her small bag with clothes and a few of her favorite things, eager to spend the day with her father. She didn't suspect that this trip would be anything but ordinary. Jeremy had spent the night before preparing for the journey. He made sure the car was packed with essentials, trying his best to keep the anxiety that gnawed at him under control. His heart pounded as he glanced at Aiyana while she smiled, oblivious to the true nature of their trip. The guilt that weighed heavily on him was something he had buried deep inside, pushing it aside in the rush of the moment. Aiyana's innocence made it easier for him to pretend everything was normal, even as he struggled with the decision he had made. As they drove out of town, Aiyana chatted excitedly about the things she hoped to see in the city. She was a bright, curious girl who had always loved exploring new places, and she trusted her father implicitly. Jeremy's mind raced, his thoughts constantly shifting between the guilt he felt and the cold rationalization that this was the only way. He told himself that it would be for the best, that he was doing this to ensure their survival, but deep down he knew it was a lie. The drive felt longer than it should have, the silence in the car growing unbearable. When they reached their destination, a secluded spot near the outskirts of the town, Jeremy's stomach twisted. This wasn't a public event. It was just a stop before he handed Aiyana over to the stranger who would take her far from everything she knew. He looked at her, her face full of trust and excitement, and for the first time, he wanted to turn around to undo what he had done. But he didn't. Jeremy handed her a small, reassuring smile before taking her hand and leading her to the place where Vance would be waiting. Aiyana, still unaware, followed along, her innocent joy masking the danger that lay ahead. She was eager to see the city, to explore something new, and she had no reason to doubt her father's words. The moment she was handed off to the stranger, Jeremy's heart sank. He watched as Aiyana was led away, her small hand gripped by someone she had never met. For the first time in her life, she was going to face a world that would strip away her innocence and force her into an existence far darker than she could ever have imagined. Back in Oak River, news of Aiyana's disappearance spread quickly. Neighbors began to notice her absence, and before long the entire town was buzzing with worry. Jeremy quickly told a story about a sudden argument that had caused Aiyana to run away. He claimed she was angry with him and had disappeared into the night. His explanation didn't sit well with anyone who knew the family. Aiyana had always been a quiet, obedient child. The idea that she would leave her home and family behind seemed implausible to those who knew her best. But Jeremy stood by his story, determined to keep the truth hidden, even as his guilt grew heavier with every passing hour. Search parties were organized, and the local authorities were called in. Flyers with Aiyana's picture were posted throughout the town. But all the while, Jeremy's heart was being torn apart. The look on his daughter's face when he had let her go haunted him. Every time he saw her smiling face in the missing person reports, a wave of remorse washed over him, yet he refused to admit the truth to anyone. As the days passed, the search for Aiyana grew more desperate. Jeremy watched helpless as the community rallied together to search for the child he had abandoned. He could no longer pretend that his actions were justified, but it was too late to turn back now. Aiyana was gone, and he had sold her for the price of a fleeting sense of relief. What had once seemed like a solution to his problems had now become the darkest regret of his life, and every moment that passed without her was a reminder of the decision he had made. Weeks went by, and the small town of Oak River became consumed with the search for Aiyana. Her disappearance remained the central topic of every conversation, and the community rallied together in an effort to find her. Posters bearing her image were plastered on walls, telephone poles, and storefronts. There was an overwhelming sense of confusion and dread as friends, neighbors, and strangers alike wondered where the young girl had gone. No one, except for Jeremy, knew the horrifying truth. Despite the widespread search and the community's best efforts, no trace of Aiyana was found. Jeremy, however, was silent, almost too silent. His heart, weighed down with guilt, continued to beat in constant turmoil, but he was careful to avoid drawing suspicion. His explanation that she had run away after an argument remained intact, though it became increasingly harder to sell. Something about his demeanor seemed off. His avoidance of eye contact, his uncharacteristic stillness, made people wonder if he was hiding something. But Jeremy was skilled at deflecting questions, redirecting attention to the ongoing search efforts. In the meantime, investigators began to dig deeper into the case. They questioned Jeremy several times, probing him for any inconsistencies in his story. But every time, Jeremy remained composed, offering the same explanation. Aiyana had run away. There were no signs of foul play, no physical evidence pointing to an abduction. But as the days turned into weeks, the authorities began to suspect that something more sinister was at work. They started investigating deeper into Jeremy's finances, his acquaintances, and any connections that could provide clues. It was during this investigation that an anonymous tip came in. A mysterious source with knowledge of the underground world provided information about an individual named Vance. Vance wasn't a well-known figure, but he was connected to a network involved in trafficking. His name had come up in previous investigations, though nothing concrete had ever been found. This time, however, the lead seemed promising. The tip suggested that Vance might have had a role in Aiyana's disappearance, but it wasn't clear how or why. The authorities quickly tracked down Vance's whereabouts. A man with a reputation for working in the shadows, he was known to have connections with various criminal enterprises, including those linked to human trafficking. The police began to piece together a profile of him. An elusive, well-connected individual with a history of dealing in illicit activities. What they didn't know at the time was that Vance's involvement with Jeremy was not a chance encounter. He had been the one to offer the solution to Jeremy's desperate financial situation. Vance's operation was far-reaching, and his influence extended into the darkest corners of society. His connections allowed him to procure children from families in desperate situations, promising them a life of luxury, or so he claimed. In truth, the children were often sent to faraway places, forced into a world of exploitation and abuse. Jeremy, in his desperation, had fallen into this web, believing Vance's words when he had said Aiyana would be well taken care of. It became clear that Jeremy had sold his daughter to Vance in exchange for money, the very money he so desperately needed to pay off his debts and care for his wife. But the trade, though it had temporarily alleviated Jeremy's financial burden, was more than he could ever have anticipated. Vance had taken Aiyana, but he was not interested in keeping her. Instead, she was just another asset in his network, a commodity to be moved to the highest bidder. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered records of previous transactions between Vance and other families in similar financial straits. Each case was eerily similar. Families pushed to the brink, offered an escape in exchange for a child. But it wasn't just Aiyana. There were other children involved, and their fates were just as uncertain. The full extent of Vance's operation began to surface, revealing a criminal empire that spanned far beyond what the small town of Oak River could have imagined. The investigation quickly turned into a manhunt for Vance. Authorities knew that they had to act fast to prevent more children from being harmed. As the pieces fell into place, they also began to realize the true depth of the situation. Vance was not just a criminal figure. He was the key to an underground network that had been preying on families like Jeremy's for years. For Jeremy, the revelation of Vance's involvement was a crushing blow. His attempt to solve his financial problems by selling his daughter had only dragged him deeper into a nightmare. The man who had promised a better life for Aiyana had in fact placed her in a far darker one. Aiyana's first few days in the compound were filled with confusion and terror. The promise of a better life had quickly unraveled into a nightmare. She was transported far from Oak River to a remote, desolate place, surrounded by thick forest and high fences. There were no welcoming smiles, no warmth, only cold, stone-faced guards who ignored her presence, treating her as though she were nothing more than an object. The place felt suffocating, as though the air itself was thick with fear. Upon arrival, she was stripped of any personal belongings and given a plain uniform to wear, like all the other girls in the compound. They had all been brought there under similar pretenses, promises of a new life far away from their families. But the reality was much darker. Aiyana's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the other girls move about silently, their eyes hollow and devoid of hope. Some were older, some younger, but all were trapped in the same cruel system. They had been taken, just like her, from families who had been promised a way out of their financial struggles. The compound was surrounded by high walls with barbed wire lining the top, making it impossible to escape. Aiyana soon realized that she was locked in, with no way out and no one to help her. The guards patrolled the area day and night, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of resistance. There was no room for rebellion, no room for mistakes. The few times she tried to speak with the other girls, they looked at her with a mix of pity and fear, as if any conversation could be used against them. Trust was a luxury none of them could afford. Food was sparse and bland, and the girls were given only the bare minimum to survive. Aiyana's stomach often growled in protest, but the hunger was something she would learn to endure, as would the other girls. They were all conditioned to obey the rules: eat when told, sleep when told, and speak only when spoken to. There was no room for individuality, no room for anything other than submission. Aiyana quickly realized that survival in this place meant keeping your head down and trying to blend in. As the days dragged on, Aiyana felt the sting of the reality she had been thrust into. The compound had no windows, no view of the outside world, and no way of knowing how long she would remain there. She began to notice the shifts in the other girls. Some had given up entirely, their spirits broken by months or years of being trapped. Others, like her, clung to the smallest glimmers of hope, refusing to let the darkness completely consume them. Aiyana's nights were filled with nightmares, haunted by the image of her father and the promise he had made. Had he truly believed that selling her would provide a better life for her? Was this the price of his desperation? These questions twisted in her mind, gnawing at her with every passing hour. She missed her family desperately, but she also felt a deep sense of betrayal, unsure of how to reconcile the love she had for her father with the horror he had forced her to endure. It wasn't long before Aiyana began to observe the routines of the compound. She took note of the guards' shifts, the times when they were least attentive, the areas of the compound that seemed less secure. Despite the fear that gripped her, she began to think of ways to escape. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Escaping would require patience, timing, and an immense amount of courage. But even in the face of constant terror, Aiyana refused to give up. She had to believe that there was a way out, a way to return to her life, to her family, and to the freedom that had been stolen from her. Each day that passed in the compound was a struggle for Aiyana to maintain her sense of self. The isolation, the fear, and the physical and emotional exhaustion were wearing her down, but she held on to the belief that somehow, some way, she would escape. She kept to herself, trying not to attract attention, but inside, her mind was always calculating, always planning. The desire to return home was a fire that burned within her, and it would drive her actions in the days to come. The weeks in the compound passed in a haze of monotony and fear. Aiyana had learned to stay quiet, to blend into the background, and to keep her head down. She spent her days following the strict rules set by the guards, moving like a shadow in the oppressive silence of the place. But beneath the surface, she was plotting. Every movement of the guards, every shift change, every pattern in the routine was carefully memorized. Aiyana knew that her only hope of escaping was in her ability to remain unnoticed, to be patient, and to wait for the right moment to strike. Her chances came unexpectedly. One evening, the compound's usual schedule was disrupted by the arrival of a new group of girls. The guards were distracted, focused on the newcomers as they were processed into the compound. This was the window Aiyana had been waiting for. The moment was fleeting, but in the chaos she saw her chance. She knew it wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be perfect, but it was the only opportunity she had. Aiyana's heart raced as she moved quickly but quietly, slipping away from her small room and into the narrow hallways that led to the outer fence. The compound, though heavily guarded, had weak points, places where the fencing had been damaged or forgotten about. She had noticed them during her days of observation, always careful not to let anyone see her interest. Now, with the confusion surrounding the new girls, she was ready to act. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she crept along, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She had no idea what would happen if she were caught. Would she be punished? Or would she face something even worse? She couldn't afford to think about it. The thought of returning to the life she had come from, of seeing her family again, kept her moving forward. As she reached the fence, she saw the small gap in the wire, barely large enough for her to squeeze through. She had tested it in her mind 100 times, imagining herself slipping through undetected. Now, standing before it, she had no time to hesitate. She knelt down, pulling at the wire as quietly as she could, her fingers trembling with fear. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she slipped her body through the gap. She had made it. But her freedom was only just beginning. The compound was set deep in the forest, far from any nearby town, and Aiyana had no idea where she was. But she knew one thing. She had to keep moving. She darted into the woods, her heart hammering in her chest, not daring to look back. She had no plan, no destination, only the instinct to run, to put as much distance between herself and the compound as possible. Aiyana ran for what felt like hours, through the darkened woods, the trees casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. The sounds of the forest surrounded her, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, but none of it mattered. She couldn't stop now. Her muscles burned with the effort, but she pushed herself forward, ignoring the pain. Every second counted. The further she got from the compound, the safer she would be. Or so she hoped. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. Aiyana's legs ached, and her breathing became shallow, but she refused to stop. She stumbled through the forest, her clothes torn and dirty, her hands scraped from the branches and rocks she had brushed against. Her mind swam with thoughts of home, of her family and the life she had left behind. She thought of her father. What had he done? Why had he allowed this to happen?